Are we recording right now?
We are recording right now. We're doing it.
All right. All
Sectionalism
right. Awesome.
Archive.
Awesome. Yeah, so I actually wrote an article like probably like a year ago. I'm not sure when, but it was basically sort of debunking the whole feminist Neolithic Europe sort of Gimbutas theory. Maria Gimbutas is sort of the one. There were people before her who thought of this, but she was the one who really like made it popular. The idea that Neolithic Europe was like this peaceful, advanced, and feminist, or I guess the word she uses is matristic society. And yeah, it's like she's kind of onto something, but as time has gone on, we've realized actually some of these people were like really quite warlike, especially like the megalithic cultures and like all of the like very like Western hunter gatherer rich cultures of the late Neolithic. So they had a lot of hunter gatherer DNA. It's possible that it was like I always like this theory that it was like a WHG slave revolt, but it's more likely that it's just like a hybrid culture. I think it's the Mickelsburg culture, if I remember correctly, and they sort of just expanded over northern and western Europe and brought that WHG DNA back. But yeah, they were pretty warlike, and even before them, like we have evidence now that family lines probably went through the father in Neolithic Europe, which would that would suggest patriarchality, patrilineality. It's sort of looking more like they were at least somewhat patriarchal, certainly not matriarchal, and on that subject, like the Venus figurines, first of all, half of them aren't even from like the Neolithic. Most of them are from actually the Paleolithic. And like Bronze Age Pervert talks about this. Like he talks about how like when people misunderstand the Longhouse, they think of like Neolithic like mega villages, and in reality, perhaps we should be thinking more along the lines of like this Paleolithic band society where nobody even knows that sex causes reproduction. Yeah, so that's what I have to say about that. But also like Maria Gimbutas was just straight up wrong about a lot of the groups she thought were Kurgan cultures. They were actually Neolithic Europeans. So that's just more evidence to suggest that actually Neolithic Europe was not super peaceful and everything all peachy, all effeminate. They were smaller, but they were still quite warlike and at least somewhat patriarchal.
Yeah, I mean, when you said hunter gatherer revolt, I was like, and the fact you wrote that a year ago, I mean, I'm basing it on the Razib Khan article. That's what kind of got my noggin jogging. I assume that you're looking at that research that he's summarizing, and yeah, it's very interesting because from my impression really up until recently was that that Neolithic Indo-European divide and the distinction between those two cultures was on like that it was a longhouse, that it was matriarchal, that and that view has like eroded over time, but it's still I still had some kind of level of residual belief in that narrative just from hearing it over and over and seeing so many memes, right? It's always
Yeah.
like the Indo-European Chad, and he comes in and he just smashes like this 9 to 5 bug man who's like tilling the fields. And also, I think the reason why that appeals as like a truthy meme, is because the Greeks kind of dug into that and they sort of presented this contrast between the farmer is ruled over by the warrior, and so you look at that and you think, okay, maybe this aspect of Greek culture is a representation of two civilizations that collided, and then they formed this caste system on top of each other. And now the way that I'm thinking is that these farmers were pretty brutal in their own right. They were pretty extreme in
Yeah.
their own right. And it's not that they were weak, is that they kind of overextended themselves and they created these empires where they were exacting tribute or they were enslaving way too many people. And in fact, Haiti is a good example of this, right? The population of Haiti was like 10% white, 10% colored,
Yeah.
80% black. And the French just ruled over, it was a 1 to 9 ratio or something, or a 2 to 2 to 8 depending on how you count the colors. But they did that, and then the British and the Spanish, who were competing with them in the Caribbean, just started arming the revolutionaries and helping them out and running,
Yeah.
embargoes and blockades. And when you're 10% of the population, and then they alienated the cut, like there were some mixed race people who were kind of going back and forth and trying to figure out what they were going to do. And the white people were just like, no, we're going to be fine without. We don't need to make an alliance with you. We'll be fine on our own. And then they got
Yeah.
slaughtered. And then eventually the mixed race people get slaughtered too.
Yep.
So,
Exactly.
so kind of, I almost view what happened there is like there was like a Haitian style slave system, and they were super overconfident in they're like, oh, nothing will ever bad happen. We'll always be kings. And then the Indo-Europeans come in and they don't like directly, because it's like the conquistadors. It's like 500 dudes come in and they have some military advantages. Maybe they have chariots, maybe they have horses or something. But they come in and it's not that they like directly defeat them in one-on-one combat, is that they go around starting all these slave revolts. And that myth, that's such a pervasive myth of like, you see it all the time. I think there's that movie Ants where there's like these these ants are being ruled over, and then like someone will come in like a Robin Hood style figure, and like there'll be a slave uprising, and then that's kind of the story of Jesus. That's kind of like the Marxist narrative. And so I think actually the basis for that is these historical, I don't know if that's like an encoded ancestral memory or something of like, you're like tilling the fields, you're a slave, and then like some Indo-European chariot arrives on the horizon, and you're like, the gods have come to save us, and then they come in and they like just they kill all your masters, and then like the Indo-Europeans are like, okay, what do we do now? Like we like destroyed this civilization, and then they're like, well, we should probably start ruling over it, and then they just kind of like re-enslave all the people and create a new system on top of it, which is kind of that's what the Germans did with the Roman collapse. Is they came in, they sacked Rome, and they're like, okay, we defeated the Romans, what do we do now? And they're like, well, I guess we are the Romans now. Like, I guess we'll just try to be good Romans and continue the empire. What's another example of people coming in? I think, okay, so this is my theory of the Indo-European invasion of India, is that India was already already had a caste system. And I think we've discussed this in the comments, perhaps, is that they already had a caste system, and the Indo-Europeans came in, they wrecked civilization, and then they inserted themselves into that existing caste system and just called it an Aryan caste system, but it was like inserting into an existing thing. So like the Dalit versus Vaishya distinction already, it predates the Aryan invasions, and they just came in and they like renamed it. They like added Sanskrit on top of an existing thing. That's my theory, also, of why it was so remarkably easy to do. Whereas if you look at what happened in Europe, it seems like much more slow, like waves of invasions and migrations over hundreds of years. Whereas in India, it looks a little bit more like they just kind of came in and then like very quickly took over and completely changed the language, at least in North India. And why it was so easy is like, again, look at the conquistadors. They come in, there's already a centralized state All they have to do is decapitate it, kill the emperor, and then say, we're the emperor now. And people are already sort of primed to just follow what the central government does. Versus, Europe, which was not a centralized empire, it was a bunch of little different kind of feudal city states or something. That's why it was a longer process. What do you think? What do you think of all that?
Well, it's a very interesting theory, but unfortunately, my opinion is actually quite different. So first of all, I wouldn't really say that Neolithic Europe was a slave society. Like it was, you could say that they sort of like lived. You could say they sort of lived like slaves just by like how like restrictive their life and diet was. But it was really more like there wasn't really like an elite class. Like there's not really a lot of evidence that there was like an elite like ruling military elite or anything like that. It was probably more like you had like these religious figures, and that's also probably why you see like these massive like instances of human sacrifice in Neolithic Europe. um but yeah, I would say that things got like much more hierarchical under the Indo-Europeans. But the thing is, like, it wasn't like life got worse for some people. I mean, probably initially it did because of all of the war and bloodshed. But like it's kind of like how people sort of have this misunderstanding of in capitalism, like if the 1% gets wealthier, then everyone else must be getting poorer. Like in real life, the Indo-Europeans probably came in and they established themselves, but they also brought new technologies. They were not themselves like extremely innovative, but they did adopt a lot of technologies very early. I think the composite bow is an example of this, and obviously the wheeled vehicle, horse domestication. There's some evidence that they actually did. Like they might have actually just been the first people to start riding horses. It's disagreed on if it was them or if it was some of the people to the east of them. Um, but yeah, what happened in Europe with the Indo-Europeans? If I had to compare it to two historical events, the first would be the Slavic expansion, and the second would probably be like the Mongol invasions, which I'll get to that in a second. But basically, the reason is that even though it took a long time for the Indo-Europeans to fully conquer Europe, um, it happened in like short bursts. So like basically like the Yamnaya expanded over the course of like a few generations, but then there was a bit of a halt. And then again, the corded ware culture in Northern Europe expanded rapidly. And they did make a lot of strategic alliances with the locals, but it's sort of like because you do see like haplogroups like I and yeah, you see a lot of I in Northern Europe, which implies maybe some of the local elites allied with the Indo-Europeans and sort of like use them to their advantage against their enemies. And yeah, I definitely think that happened to some extent, but it's also like you have to remember that they are going town by town. So it's like if you go town by town and then you incorporate like 10% of the elite in each town, eventually you're going to have this sort of hybrid group. It's much more difficult than it is in like the 15th century where you have like millions of people coming to the Americas having like 6 kids. Um, but yeah, it took place very fast, but in in certain bursts. Like you have like people in like Spain, Spanish Bellbeaker folk who have like grandparents in Germany. Like it happened. It was a few bursts of expansion, and it was probably partially because of plague, which is why which is also why the Slavic and Mongol invasions are good examples, because the Slavs invade right after the plague of Justinian, and yeah, that same virus, it's sort of endemic to like to like the Eurasian steppe. Like it's always there. Like you have it in like marmots and stuff. And I think that did help the Indo-Europeans to some extent. And also they were just fast. Like they had wheeled vehicles, they were mobile, and Neolithic Europe had just gone through sort of like a collapse, like maybe a few centuries earlier, if I remember correctly. Um,
Yeah, that's a
yeah, and how,
controversial point because, my understanding of the latest research is that the reduction in pottery production, for example, it occurs after the Indo. So the idea is that the Indo-Europeans precipitate the collapse of the economy, and then it slowly recovers over time after kind of a dark age. The reason I like that model is because I think it accords with the Sea Peoples, where you have some kind of ecological disaster going on in Northern Europe that starts to push populations down, this domino effect where people just keep going down toward the Mediterranean, and then they interact with these pirates, and then they sail around, and then they start attacking the Hittites. And so, one theory would be that, because we don't have, exact um, whatever dates on something, you could say if you didn't have writing, then you could say, well, maybe the Hittite Empire collapsed first for unrelated reasons, and then because it was weak, the Sea Peoples came in. But because we do have writing, we see this thing of we had this empire, and then these people came and destroyed us, and everything collapsed. So because we don't have the writing in the case of Neolithic Europe, although there are Vinca symbols, so we can't decode them, but they might have actually had some kind of writing, but we can't decode it, so we don't have some document that says everything was good until the Fire Nation attacked and then everything got collapsed. So yeah, I mean, I guess I tend to be more of and the same thing with Rome. Like before the sack of Rome, Rome was in you could say a weakened or degenerated state, but it wasn't collapsed. It really took that external invasion to actually cause the collapse of Rome. And also, I mean, you could sort of dispute it. Maybe the synthesis of this is that, clearly it can kind of be the empire could be in a weakened state, maybe for reasons of plague or something else. And then also the invasion, causes a collapse. But those two things are, they're both kind of, they're both factors. It doesn't have to be 100% one or the other. I mean, a lot of people say that with the Native Americans, actually, at Cahokia, which is these giant mounds. It was the biggest Mississippian culture. That culture collapsed in 1350, so 100 years before, Europeans had ever come over. So the idea is that, there was this sort of coincidental collapse, and then Europeans come over a century later, and they kind of mop up the remnants of what was originally so in that model, it would actually be, there would be two collapses. There would be the pre-European collapse of the 14th century, and then there would be the European precipitated plague-related collapse or disease-related collapse of the 16th century. Another thing you mentioned is regarding the speed of the conquest and how much admixture you're going to accumulate as you go from town to town. And I guess the distinction I always make is in South America, where the Catholics were, they didn't just make it easy for people to convert to Christianity. They actually gave you free stuff. Every time you would get baptized, they would give you food. So people would try to go and get baptized multiple times to get more food. Versus in where the English and the Dutch and even the Swedish and those people were colonizing, they said if you want to be a Christian, you need to learn how to read and write and speak English and learn the King James Bible. And that was a huge impediment to conversion. Natives did convert. That's what they created Harvard for, is to try to convert natives. But not at the conversion rate was just much lower than it was in South America. And so, you had much more admixture in South America as a result. One thing that I don't know that I would be interested to see is how did the French deal with that in Quebec? Because I'm not aware that there's a large, admixture of natives into the Quebecois population, but they were Catholic. So I wonder if, secularism, because I think the French started colonizing Quebec around the same time that the English were coming in, so that would be like 17th century. So I wonder if there was already some kind of like distinction between French Catholicism and like French colonial policy, and like whereas Spanish, Portuguese were more like wedded to the church, where maybe like the French were more independent in how they did things and they had like a more antagonistic. I don't really know a lot about that. I know the the Puritans, and I know the conquistadors, but I don't really know what those French were up to in Quebec. Um, I think the Métis people, like in the Louisiana Purchase, were mixed between French and natives. But in,
Yeah.
in Quebec, I don't know what the story is there. If they pushed everybody out or had race wars or what they were doing.
I think that the French did. I mean, I'm not an expert on it, but I think they were sort of intermediate between the I think they were more intermediate between the Spanish and the English. But the thing is, it's probably more like they were sort of just the same as the Spanish. Like they would mix with the locals, Like I think those people from the Romance countries, they're sort of they can't resist it. They can't resist the mulata, the mestiza. They love it. But but yeah, like the thing is, even the Spanish, they weren't mixing that much during the colonial period. They were mixing somewhat, but most of the mixture happened like after the revolutions. Um, and but yeah, I think so. I think that both of them probably mixed about the same amount, and we just sort of imagine the French to have mixed less. But yeah, I've heard plenty of stories of like French Quebecers sort of taking native wives, and I think they were called Métis up there too.
I
Um,
guess my point is not the actual chronology of the mixing, but the level of extermination. So like
ah,
so like when the Spanish came in, they did maintain a caste system and they didn't intermix as much as people like, imply with like yes, conquistadors did marry natives, but like that it wasn't the rule for every European who came over just automatically
yeah.
took a native wife.
The
Um,
conquistadors were like sort of a lot of them were like basically pirates. Like they were
they
not
were like incels,
super
right?
high class. Yeah, but yeah. I think I was gonna write an article on that at some point, but like incels, a lot of these like historical conquerors, like they couldn't like get laid in their home countries, so they went and they were like, if I die, then at least I died trying to get some tail.
Yeah. So I guess my point was that um, so we're talking about 16th century. Europeans are starting to come over, Spanish, Portuguese starting to come over. 17th century, they're starting to organize these territories, and at no point did they really make an attempt to like have a forced mass migration of these people or wage wars where they were just killing like 30% of the population. Like the conquistadors came in, they destroyed these Aztec and Incan empires, and then they just assumed rulership, and the population, there's kind of scattered resistance or something, but nothing significant. Whereas you look at North America, and you could almost say that because North America was not centralized into an empire, like there was the Iroquois Confederacy and things like that, but because they were not centralized into these empires, it meant that every time the Europeans had to fight a tribe, that tribe would like they'd lose 30% of their population, and then that tribe would just like flee westward, and then that just kept happening. So it was like the town by town model that you gave with the Indo-Europeans, but it wasn't really town by town because a lot of these people were hunter gatherers, and so they weren't really settled enough to like dig in like defensively
Yeah,
and be like, this is our last stand, and if we get conquered, I guess we just have to interbreed with these people. They'd be like, well, we're being attacked by the Europeans, so we can either stay and fight and get wrecked, or we could just migrate west. And so this just precipitated like this mass migration west, which then, Andrew Jackson comes around and he like intentionally, you know, orders these people to Oklahoma. Whereas stuff like that didn't really happen at the same scale in South America. And so, like, obviously, you're saying that people started mixing really only in the 19th century or later. But in North America, they didn't even have the opportunity because like the population had been forced westward and they were never agriculturally integrated. Like black
Mhm.
slaves were brought onto plantations, and then when you freed the slaves, like that population existed so that post civil rights, people could start mixing together. Whereas with the Native Americans, they had already been shipped westward. Um, they were forced into agriculture basically with the reservation system, but the reservations were so small you couldn't really grow your population. I mean, their population has grown over the last century, but um, yeah, that the reservation system, I think that there's multiple elements in there where it kind of prevented that kind of mixture of cultures and peoples together. So you could make the argument that actually the Incan and Aztec empires genetically saved the natives because it allowed the natives to be conquered more quickly, which allowed them to be integrated together as populations. Whereas the fact that the North Americans didn't have empires meant that every time they got defeated in battle, they just kept being pushed westward, which, now they're 1% of the
Yeah.
population as opposed to in South America, they're, what, depending, Bolivia, probably 80%, and, Argentina, it's like 20%, or I don't know the exact percentages, but definitely a lot more than North America. So the lesson here is that you should form an empire, and if someone takes you over, you just immediately surrender and do that. Basically, you just bend over and you take it because genetically that's what's going to be best for you. And taking that theory even further, we could then basically form a theory that like basal Eurasian, or like whatever like the most common ancestry is, by this theory would be whichever ancestry was most prone to submit to whatever ruler like came along. Versus if you're like a super badass like Apache warrior who's like, I will never submit to the white man, I will always be free and independent, then like you will end up being 1% of the population. And taking that a step further, talking about the hunter gatherers, when we look at like their DNA as being significantly wiped out and replaced, um, then maybe basically like they were the Native Americans essentially, and they like kept getting pushed back, whereas the Neolithic farmers were like, okay, you conquered us
Yeah.
fair and square, like we'll be your serfs now, and that's how they survived. Whereas the hunter gatherers were just like less less willing to be integrated into this new social structure, this new caste system or whatever. So yeah, being highly agreeable and being like submissive and feminine and stuff, I think has proven to be like a pretty good reproductive strategy when you get conquered. And so like being super masculine and principled is kind of high risk, high reward. You're more likely to
Yeah.
be genocided, but you're also more likely to genocide other people. Um, that's my takeaway from this analysis of these invasions. But what I'd like to see, and I don't know if I'll do it or you'll do it, but I'd like to see like a master sheet of not every invasion in history, but just like showing like, kind of chronologically, like here we have the Mongols, and we have like, if you ever watch like the Kings and Generals YouTube channel, like have some kind of like animated video where it kind of goes through these different things. The one we haven't talked about yet, because no one talks about this is only something I talk about, but the Black Sea deluge of 5600 BC. So my theory is that when it was a freshwater lake rather than saltwater, because it's in Ukraine, the
Hmm.
farmland was really good, and there's all these river tributaries that come out of it. So I assume that people lived along the coast, and that when the
Mm.
flood happened, it wasn't just like they were literally drowned underwater, but that all their irrigation systems, all their canals, all their crops got ruined because it was salty.
Yeah.
And so they had to flee as refugees. And around the same time, you also see like the Green Sahara turns into a desert.
Yeah.
So these two ecological events, and I don't have good evidence for this, but just like my hypothesis is that there were these two populations that in the Green Sahara, it would have been pastoralism. Around the Black Sea, it would have been agriculturalists. But they had to flee, and that's where you get like the Vinci symbols and metallurgy in the
Hmm.
Balkans, and probably they also went into the Armenian highlands and the Caucasus and stuff like that. So that's like the panspermia diaspora event where we get the flood myth from, and it
Hmm.
transmits to all these different cultures. I don't know. Seems like a no-brainer. The only problem is there's no material evidence for this other than just like circumstantially, like, well, there's some cool cultures that occur, around this area.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't think we're ever necessarily going to find that because it happened so long ago, and all the material evidence would be under salt water, which is very corrosive. So if you had any copper, if you had any writing, if you like even pottery under salt water, I think gets more corroded. I mean, obviously, like we have Roman pottery, but 7,000 years is much different than 2,000 years in terms of material degradation. So, I'm not sure I'll ever be able to prove this theory, but that's kind of in terms of like listing the different civilizational collapses that have happened. That's one where I think you look at the environment and I'm suspicious. I'm suspicious because if you look at like any Middle Eastern timeline of the age of the world, they all kind of go to 4000 BC. And you think, like, well, what happened? Like, where did Sumer come from? Where did Egypt come from? Did they come out of like nowhere? Like, how did these civilizations get started? So, my theory is that it was refugees from the Black Sea went to Egypt and went to Sumer, and they kind of like kick-started things over there. The timeline doesn't exactly match up because you're talking about like a 1600-year difference.
Hmm.
Um, so it's not. Maybe it's a little bit too big of a stretch. But that's my. Have you ever heard about the Black Sea deluge?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard about it in passing, but I'm definitely not an expert. I definitely don't know much about it. You probably know much more than me. Um, although I will say I've seen some very suspicious things that have been found in the Sahara on Google Maps, and I think that might be good evidence that maybe there was something a little bit more there a long, long time ago, back when
You're
it was
talking about
habitable. But
nuclear bombs in the Sahara Desert.
I wasn't thinking nuclear bombs. I've just seen like there's just these extremely like random like forts that have been found in the Sahara that are like very far away from every modern civilization, and like it's totally possible that they were like some sort of like maybe at one point they were an oasis in recorded history, but now it's just dried up and everyone left. But
Yeah.
you never know how old it is. We nobody's gonna go out there and like date it. Like it's not, it's like barely habitable. But yeah, I I think like um I don't know about that last part with like Sumer and stuff, but it's totally possible that there were like civilizations that have been destroyed by the rising sea levels that were after the ice age. Some people talk about Doggerland. I don't know about that. That's probably unlikely. They were probably just like normal hunter gatherers, but with Black Sea, I could see that definitely being the case.
Yeah, so there is a site in southern Egypt in the middle of the desert called Nabta Playa, and there's supposed to be the stone circle there that people say is like astrologically aligned. When I looked into this, the problem is the dating because it's a site that was like inhabited over thousands of years. So trying to figure out like when those rocks were erected to like predict the solar eclipse or
Uh,
whatever that's supposed to predict, it's like what are you gonna do? You're gonna scrape off some of this or that and you're gonna carbon date it, but like when was that scraping derived from? Is that more recent? Is that later? So I don't understand carbon dating well enough to determine those things. I just know that there's problems with carbon dating, and people are always complaining about it. So yeah, I mean, but the earliest date I found for that was 8,000 BC. So the idea was that like it was a megalithic structure constructed before any other megalithic structure that we know about. It's arranged in a pattern that people say would predict the summer solstice or something. So if it's true, it indicates that they had some concept of a calendar, which means they need math, which means either they're doing it in their head or they had some kind of writing system, and they erected that. Now there's no evidence of agriculture there, so they would have been pastoralists. But obviously, agriculture had been going on before that in 10,000 BC. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, those megalithic structures. I mean, I don't know. I feel really sympathetic with those megalithic cultures because I like brutalism and I want to build giant stuff too. I really like my favorite form of architecture is one where it's just pure kind of natural habitat and then you just erect a giant phallic like skyscraper, and it's like the only building for like 10 square miles. But it's just like this giant, singular, powerful, overwhelming structure that just overwhelms everything else versus,
Oh.
like the suburbs where it's the same cookie cutter house spammed 1,000 times. And that's like my least favorite form of architecture. So I think that it makes I always appreciate it when I see these big stones that are being erected for whatever reason. That always seems like a logical thing. That's what I always do. Like, what would you do if you were plopped, I don't know, some random point in the past 10,000 years ago, and you have your modern knowledge, assuming that you don't get immediately killed. What do you try to teach people? How do you try to direct society from that point? Is it even possible? Do you trick people? You use astrological knowledge to predict eclipses or something, and then you tell them to build big stone temples. I don't
Um,
think I could do it. I don't know astrology. I'm not sure what knowledge I would have to like prove to them that I was a wizard or a warlock or something like that.
yeah.
You're gonna get eaten. You're gonna get cannibalized by. Well, actually, what do you think? Is cannibalism, is that sort of a hunter gatherer thing in general, like Papua New Guinean hunter gatherers, Neolithic people don't do that?
Um, yeah. First of all, you are like you're cutting out a little bit. So yeah. Yeah, I understand what you were saying at first with like um if I cut out, then you can't see me. So I don't know if you've like stopped talking or not. Uh, I think yeah. Being like being like a cannibal is like a very like Paleolithic thing, and you see during like the Mesolithic, like these these Western hunter gatherers, they come in and they defeat what remains of the Ice Age Europeans, and suddenly cannibalism, it's not as common anymore. And I think like even in like Africa and Papua New Guinea and the Americas, you could sort of associate it with like this very primitive culture, the Paleolithic, but they were, like compared to the rest of the world, they were very primitive. And, some of them could really be considered still in the Paleolithic, like, especially in like Australia and Papua New Guinea. Um, but yeah, I thought of this funny meme a while back. Like like the human sacrifices must stop meme with like it's like the Spaniard and the Aztecs.
We're not
Do
gonna
you know that
learn
one?
what the meme was.
Oh,
The
oh,
meme will forever remain a secret.
oh. Did it get cut out?
It got cut out. Like you laid it up for the punchline, and 40 minutes in, my internet has decided to give out on us. So maybe we'll have to leave it as a cliffhanger. People will
Yeah.
not, they won't get to know what happens in the meme. That's for premium subscribers only. Um, but yeah,
Drivers.
I'm glad we were able to get in a good 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Probably next time I'll fix the internet and everything will be improved. But yeah, it was
Yeah.
good checking in with you. If I'm able to hear you for this last part, um, what you working on? What kind of essays? What kind of projects are you got for the future?
Yeah. Coding and like sort of like a series I'm writing. I'm trying to write the third installation of that. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's like fantasy but with some sci-fi because it's like it's basically in a post-apocalyptic world, post-apocalyptic terraformed Venus, like thousands of years after today. But now it's like they're living sort of in the medieval times. Um, and other than that, I'll probably write an update to. I wrote like a beliefs general post like a year ago. I'll probably write an update to that because I feel like that post is like it's okay, but it's like I kind of want to go through issues like I saw Sebastian Jensen's beliefs post and I was like, wow, this is like very well formatted. Maybe I should do like his. Like you just go through every issue, and you give a brief opinion on it. Um, and other than that, I'll probably write some reviews of like stuff that I've watched. I just watched I just watched the first season of a certain anime. I don't know, you've probably never heard of it. It's pretty popular though. It's Code Geass. It's
What do you mean? I've never heard of Code Geass. Only my
I don't
favorite
know.
anime.
Oh really? Well,
Yeah, I've
don't
been
spoil it
post.
for me.
I've
I'm only on the I only just finished the first season, so yeah,
All right. I won't say anything. But
it's
yeah,
very good.
yeah. I mean, I think it just stylistically. Sebastian has an anime review Substack where he talks about this, and stylistically, I feel that it there's kind of like a triangular nature to anime where you kind of have like a silly fan service aspect of like there's no plot, there's no characterization, it's just kind of cutesy, sexy, whatever. So you have that aspect, and then you have an aspect that's like dark, serious, philosophical, deep, that kind of like contemplative anime, which I think is like Full Metal Alchemist, Ergo Proxy. It's like confronting you with existential religious questions. And then you have the form of anime. And by the way, this is just the tripartite class structure: the Tamasic, the Sattvic, and then you have the Rajasic, which is like basically like Naruto. Like he's a hero, believe it. Like you can do anything. So it's basically moralization. It's like anyone can do
Yeah.
anything, and if you put your mind to it, you too can be like a hero and never give up. So it's like those are sort of the three pillars of anime, and most of them rely too heavily on one of them. It's either there's too much fan service, or it's too dark and scary and like causing an existential depression, or it's just like Naruto, which is this repetitive like everything's going to be okay, just trust your heart and believe in yourself, and that gets very old very quickly, especially with filler episodes. But then you have Code Geass that I feel like, perfect. It's like the platonic anime. So that's what I appreciate about it. And I also really love the
Yeah.
soundtrack. It's got a beautiful orchestral
Oh,
soundtrack.
definitely.
And I think just the framework, right? You have the British Empire, but it's based in America. And
Yep.
so everything's about like hating slash loving the British. So it really brings together like this Anglo globalist angst, where everyone loves and is obsessed with America, but simultaneously everyone hates America and blames America for everything bad in the world. Like whether you're on the left or right, it's like America's the worst thing ever. But also
Yep.
America's secretly super cool, and we all will like we all secretly want to be George Washington. We all secretly want to be like a 1950s housewife or something. Like everyone loves Anglo culture. Like I actually I have an article I'm working on called Chuckle Fuck Leftism, and I sort of get into the Joker and the Penguin as these comic book villains who are inversions of Anglo stereotypes. So the real name of the Penguin is like Edwin Cottlesworth or something, and then like the Joker isn't Arthur Fleck. I forget what his name is originally, but he wears like this tweed jacket. Like if you look at the fashion of the Joker, he's kind of wearing this. He's wearing like a breasted or whatever the fancy fashion term is. Like he's wearing this
Mhm.
like woolen tweed vest, which is like very conservative, traditionalist, archaic way to dress, and so in this certain way, all of his mannerisms, all the things that he says, uh, like the Riddler is also like this. Like it's all these kind of like Anglo-Saxon riddles and
Hmm.
like turns of phrase. You see this with Harry Potter as well, of like worshiping Anglo culture, like Hufflepuff, Gryffindor, Ravenclaw. It's all Anglo-Saxon syntactical constructions. And people get really excited over that, while at the same time, if you kind of ask them ideologically, like, do you think like Anglos are the best people ever? And they'll be like, well, what about the wars and the slavery and all this stuff? But despite that contradiction, people can't help like you like sneak it in. Like people love the Joker, people love Harry Potter, people love Code Geass, and so like even there's this deep contradiction where you could even say Darth Vader, like with Grand Moff
Yep.
Tarkin. There's clearly like some British Empire thing there. Like there's this weird thing where people like actually love the villain, and the villain is the British Empire, and that's kind of what keeps us interested. Is like the secret. We secretly want the British Empire to actually win, but we can't admit that, so we have to make them the villains. And I feel like Code Geass directly addresses that. And I'm not going to tell you how. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but I feel like they engage with it once you see it. If you see it, then you'll know what I'm talking about. But
Yeah.
that's the situation. So I'll be excited to see your review on that. That'll be good
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. I should finish that. I don't know, probably like within the next. I'll probably finish it like a month from now. I'm only halfway through because I'm like when I watch anime, I like to watch it with other people. So it's like it's hard to like watch a lot of it at once. But I totally would if I wasn't obligated to like not go ahead of other people. But yeah, like I totally agree with like the British like love hate. Like every villain has to have like a British accent. You see that a lot in Star Wars. Star Wars is I have there's another iFunnier on Substack named James Knox, and he has a very good Star Wars article because he was a big fan. Um, but yeah, a lot of Anglo villains who everybody hates, but secretly, they love the Anglo drip. They love the vibes, as the kids say.
Yeah, that's why I feel like the aesthetics of the dissident writer are a little bit cursed, because there's so much what do they call that, toitophilia, or like the wearaboos,
Yeah,
where it's like
wearable. Yep.
this obsession with like the Pickelhaube and like
Yeah.
the Viking and this haplogroup I people, and like we're and the Prussian militarism, and we're all goose stepping and whatever. And it's like, I don't know, Braveheart, or like, American Revolution, or even just like, another one is Pirates of the Caribbean, like Captain
Oh
Jack
yeah.
Sparrow. It's all these, like, you have obviously the British Empire are the villains, but also the pirates are also English. So it's like Anglo pirates fighting the Anglo government, and obviously the pirates represent the Americans in this situation. But still, like, the pirate aesthetic is a very Anglo aesthetic. I
Yeah.
think you've also written or talked about at some point. If you haven't, definitely something to explore is, um, the number, like we didn't get into the Albanians very much in this recording, but there were actually a lot of Albanian pirates during like the Barbary pirate era. That whole like Islamic age of piracy, like there were a lot of like red-headed Muslims, like that's why they called them Red Beard. There were a bunch. I think there were multiple different Red Beards and Barbarossas, but they would terrorize the Mediterranean, um, as like a separate phenomenon from the Anglos. But the Anglos caught up. I mean, you could say that to be an Anglo-Saxon, you necessarily have to be a pirate, because they came over on ships, and then they raided like the Roman Celts, and then they like established their kingdom, their Anglo-Saxon kingdom. So, um, you kind of the ethnogenesis, like they are the ultimate sea peoples, because they would have never gotten to Britain without boats. And how many people can you say that for? Like maybe the Malagasy of Madagascar. You could say that for, like, I don't know. I don't know how many other people. Americans, I guess. Americans came over
Oh
on
yeah.
boats. But it's like, how many people can we look at and be like, this nation was born like on the waves. Like they didn't walk somewhere. They didn't go on a horse or a camel or something. They got on a bunch of boats. It takes a lot of infrastructure to do that. You can't. I mean,
Yeah.
we think of them as barbarians, but really constructing a fleet and like conducting like a reverse landing of Norman, like an Operation Sea Lion in like the 6th century AD. That's pretty technologically complex. That takes a lot of know-how and engineering and coordination to do that. Um, I mean, obviously, if you read like Caesar's account of invading Britain, it is it's pretty wild to hear him like he's like, the ships, they moor like off the shore, so they don't actually like land the ship on the beach. They like drop the anchor, and then all of the Romans in their armor have to like jump off the ship into the shallow water. And like, you ever wear armor, it's already quite heavy,
Yeah.
but then you're totally soggy, and you're like, all your clothes are wet, and you're up to your waist or something in seawater, and like there's probably waves, it's probably choppy, and then you have like this whole, all the Celts are assembled in battle formations on the beach, and then they like rush into the water, and people are like wrestling with swords and like stabbing each other in the water, and somehow Caesar's men are able to make it to shore, which is pretty impressive considering that the Celts like are probably naked, so they're not like soaking wet. And they make it to shore, and then they establish camp, and then like somehow again they don't starve to death, and they don't die, and they manage to like, conquer. They do like some symbolic conquest of the country, like they make some kind of treaty with one of the tribesmen, and they declare it like Roman territory, and then they go back to Gaul, and that becomes the basis of like the later invasions and the actual conquest for administration. But it's a pretty, it like, you read that and you're like, yeah, this is a pretty technically, this is a very difficult thing to do. It doesn't really matter at what point in history you're conducting a naval invasion. It's it's a pretty fascinating phenomenon. But I'm glad my internet got back on the right track so we could have a successful conclusion to this.
Yes.
Yeah, next time I'll fix the technical difficulties. But yeah, we'll do this again. Always a pleasure speaking with you.
Yep.
Um,
Same here.
take care, man. Bye bye.
All right. Have a good night.
All right. Let's pause